and can contort all they want. But the violations of international law are theirs. The loss of life, the wounding, the pain, the suffering are all their responsibilities.
Tonight at the emergency meeting, Andrew, there was some very heated moments between Ukraine's ambassador and the Russian UN envoy. Ukraine's ambassador was telling the envoy there is no purgatory for war criminals, they go straight to hell. Just as Russia's envoy was saying, this isn't a war, this is a special operation. Most people are feeling tonight like this is a war and it's going to be widespread and cause a lot of attacks and casualties. Now, tomorrow, a G7 meeting within hours now. That'll be virtual, including Canada. Stronger sanctions will, of course, be part of that. We heard that this week, that there was a second tranche of sanctions in the wings that could be used. Tonight, Ukraine is shutting down its airspace, civilian aircraft diverting around Ukraine as this crisis really swiftly develops, Andrew.
Susan Ormiston, thank you so much for reporting in Washington this evening. Now, we're going to bring in the CBC's Murray Brewster because, Murray, Susan, raises a really important point here, that we don't actually have any idea right now just how far Russia is willing to take this incursion. And so, the two most important questions here, what is the intent? What might the targets be?
Well, and some of the things that we're seeing this evening are the opening salvos. And if we go back to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, some of the very first things that we saw were explosions in Baghdad and an attempt by the military, the U.S. military at that time, to take out command and control and to hit major nodes that will confuse and help ground forces when they eventually come. So these are some of the things that we could potentially be seeing this evening, as both as Breyer has said and as some of our other reporting has come forward, that we've seen explosions that are possibly near the airport in Kyiv. There have been explosions in Odessa, and there have been explosions in Kharkov. So these are missile strikes, according to some members of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. And that is just the beginning. It paves the way, according to military experts, for ground forces to come in. Now, in Susan's report just a moment ago, as you said, she raised a very important question, and that is, how far will Russia go? And most military experts that I've been speaking with, and in a lot of the reporting that we've done over the last several weeks, have said that Russia has not assembled a military force that is large enough to take over all of Ukraine. And that's very important, because when you look at the statement that Russian President Vladimir Putin gave this evening, is that they were going to be conducting an operation in the Donbass area, which is the eastern part of Ukraine that has been contested for about 8 years. And there could be considerable ground forces that are moving to take over that area. And there were indications a couple of days ago, just after President Putin issued his declaration about that began all of this, which said that he recognizes and Russia recognizes the independence of these two, for want of a better description, what Canadians would understand as provinces of Ukraine, these two eastern provinces that are mostly Russian-speaking and that have been contested as part of a very long proxy war. In making that declaration, it was a question of whether or not the Russian forces that were going in as so-called peacekeepers or peacemakers, whether or not they were going to take over all of those provinces. The Ukrainians call them oblasts, but whether or not the Russian forces would push into trying to take over all of that area. And we've had indications over the last couple of days that, yes, indeed, that is what the intent is going to be. And so we could see some heavy ground fighting in and around eastern Ukraine. Whether or not that is going to translate into fighting into the rest of the country remains to be seen at the moment. We've had reports over the last couple of weeks and speculation that that Kyiv could be overrun, the capital could be overrun within 2 days, and that there's a heavy Russian military presence north of the capital in Belarus. So it could very well be that the concentration of force that the Russians are focusing this evening will be in the eastern part. The explosions, significantly, the explosions that may have taken place and the fighting, the ground fire that may have taken place in and around the international airport in Kyiv, that is a major command and control node for the Ukrainian military. So it could very well be that they're trying to get forces. There could be Russian special forces that are on the ground there that could be taking on some kind of role to capture that, paving the way and opening the way for perhaps some kind of airborne assault in that area. These are some of the things that a lot of military experts have been speculating on for the last number of weeks, and it is beginning to unfold over the next several hours. And the next several hours are actually going to be crucial in determining the kind of success that Russia has in conducting these operations. The Russians have a very large ground force, but the Ukrainians have a fairly battle-hardened, rather large army that is proven that it can stand toe-to-toe with Russian forces. So where the Russians have the main advantage is in air power, and that's why and tanks as well. But the Russians have the advantage of having a fairly large modern air force. And you've noticed that over the last several weeks, NATO nations have been providing Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft systems, but there's not a lot of them. And that military gap, that capability, could very well prove to be decisive for Ukraine over the next day or so.
Okay, Murray Brewster, that gives us a really good strategic sense of the military incursion that we're beginning to see at this time. Thank you so much for those insights.
You're welcome.
So as we continue to look at a clearly civilian part of Kyiv in Ukraine right now, to recap what we've seen, for months we have seen a buildup of Russian troops at its border with Ukraine, threatening an invasion. The international community responding with threats of sanctions, but over the last several weeks, a decidedly pretty intense ratcheting up of rhetoric, of pressure on the international community, leading to what we are seeing tonight. The precursor to the incursion that we saw tonight was a prohibition on air traffic over Ukraine, notably from Transport Canada, restricting Canadian air operators from flying over the country for their own safety. Of course, we also saw an emergency statement from the Russian President Vladimir Putin announcing that there would be a special military operation with the intent of demilitarizing Ukraine. Over the course of the evening, we have also been seeing sporadic reports of explosions being heard around Kyiv, around the airport, also around Kharkiv. And this operation, as we continue to watch what will unfold, I just want to bring your attention to a NATO statement that we've seen from the Secretary General saying that, "I strongly condemn Russia's reckless and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, which puts at risk countless civilian lives. Once again, despite our repeated warnings and tireless efforts to engage in diplomacy, Russia has chosen the path of aggression against a sovereign and independent country. This is a grave breach of international law and a serious threat to Euro-Atlantic security." Now, I want to bring in Jody Vittori, a professor of political science at Georgetown University, who has been following many of these developments with us. Jody, first of all, give us a sense of how it is we have gotten to this point. Why now seems to be the operative question, especially given the tensions that we've seen leading up to this.
Certainly. Yes, thank you for having me here this evening. Why now? I think it's because it's Putin's best opportunity to be able to take Ukraine, which is something that he's talked about for quite some time. This may be the best environment that he will ever have. The United States and the United Kingdom are perceived as being in a good deal of disarray. after Brexit, after the last presidential administration in the United States, with significant tensions, with a president in the past who recently threatened to withdraw from NATO and who could be back again in the future. So he's got a much weaker set of key powers that he feels that he can manipulate better. Years of sanctions or years of corruption and of the enabling of Russian influencers into the Western political system may also have given him some feeling of impunity going forward. There have been numerous reports of how Russian money has been used in the United Kingdom, of course, very famously in the United States. The Mueller investigation looked at these issues quite closely. There have been numerous journalistic reports and other reports over the years of the ability of Russian interests to be able to influence various political systems. In Canada, Transparency International Canada has talked about what they call snow washing, the ability for corruption to be used by all sorts of actors, Chinese, Russian, and others, to be able to buy their way into these countries, in many cases, to be able to purchase, not control, but at least a decent degree of influence. And so I think they saw some of the best advantages that they were going to have right now. And in addition, in the end, a lot of it just comes down to the fact that Russia's an authoritarian state, and Putin could largely do what he wanted. He had, over the years, sort of nullified any legitimate opposition, any ability for checks and balances, and he thought that Ukraine would be ripe for the picking at this time, and that NATO and the United States wouldn't be able to do as much as they would have been in the past.
Right. So Jody, I can understand how the opportunity has presented itself. I guess my question at this point is, what is the intent here? What is the goal? Because in the lead up to this moment, it seemed like the threat of violence was what Putin had on his side in terms of a bargaining chip, whether the intent was to secure security guarantees, or if there was a nationalistic motivation to what he was about to do or was considering or contemplating doing. But what is the intent of actually putting boots on the ground and moving forward with this operation now?
Be back as part of the Russian Empire, that Putin sees the fall of the Soviet Union as the biggest mistake, and he's seen the opportunity to do that now. It does look like, at least based on some of the notices that went out, particularly the notices to airmen that went out in Russian airspace, those notices are good through late May, at least for Western Russia, areas near the eastern Ukrainian border when it comes to civilian aircraft. So he seems to have a plan, at least from an aerospace perspective, to be ready to do this for a long time, for many months at least, when it comes to clearing the airspace. So we presume that that means the operations that go with it. So this seems to be a very large operation at this time, not a temporary incursion, not potentially just to take small areas. I think Medvedev made an interesting point over the last couple of days, which is his belief that, much like with Crimea and the other parts of Ukraine previously taken, the West will scream and holler and complain and sanction, but in the end, they will get used to it. And I think Putin and key oligarchs are counting on that. They've hardened themselves a great deal against sanctions. The initial sanctions that look impressive aren't really all that detrimental to much of the Russian economy. And in some ways, some of the sanctioning of key Russian oligarchs might actually strengthen Putin's hand, because it might limit the ability of oligarchs to move their money overseas, and thus Putin will have more control over them. So it looks like he's ready for the long haul, and he believes that he can withstand any pressure going forward, particularly since he knows that it probably won't be military pressure from NATO itself.
Right. Well, let me ask you just one last question about that, because we've heard time and time again that from a military standpoint, Ukraine does not stack up to Russia's military. So what is the likelihood, what is the appetite that Ukraine's allies would intervene in this incursion?
Well, previously, President Biden has made it clear that he's not going to be putting boots on the ground in Ukraine itself, that he's going to be reinforcing NATO. And while there have been some additional aircraft, for example, F-35 sent forward out of Italy up into Eastern Europe, into NATO countries, there have been some assistance in providing more and more arms to Ukraine, but there has not been any indications that any NATO countries are willing to actually substantially arm and reinforce Ukrainian forces beyond perhaps just arming them. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, will be fighting for their own territory. That gives them a certain advantage, the home field advantage, if you will. And certainly in a insurgency environment, which will be devastating on the Ukrainian people. But, you know, as the United States has witnessed the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan, with a motivated population who's willing to take on insurgency, it's one thing to take territory. Putin can certainly bomb it. He can certainly destroy lots of things. He can probably take most of Ukraine, if not all of it. Holding it is going to be a very different manner, and governing it's going to be a very, very different manner if the population really doesn't want him there.
Jody Vittori, a professor of political science at Georgetown University. Good of you to join us at this hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as we continue to watch developments in Ukraine, this is a country that is under a state of emergency. Earlier this evening, the Russian President Vladimir Putin making an emergency address stating that a special military operation would be getting away, and indeed there have been sporadic reports of explosions being heard. We are going to stay glued to this story over the course of the evening. More coverage coming up on The National.
Closed captioning is brought to you by the Globe and Mail. Regardless of economic conditions, an investment in yourself will always yield a positive return. Make better financial decisions with the Globe and Mail.
When you think of a cup of Nespresso, where does your mind go? Does it take you to the hot springs of Costa Rica, where we bathe our malty and balanced Arabica beans in the mineral-rich waters? Or to the dry, tropical heat of Nicaragua?
Welcome back. We are following breaking news tonight in Ukraine. That country's foreign minister says Russia has launched a full-scale invasion. He says peaceful Ukrainian cities are under strikes. He says the world can and must act now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has released a statement condemning what he calls Russia's egregious attack. We do have reporters standing by in Kiev, in Russia, near the border, and in Washington, D.C. tonight. We are going to get to all of that in just a few minutes, but first we're going to turn to a major development today here at home. 10 days after the federal government made history invoking the Emergencies Act for the very first time, the Prime Minister says the emergency is over and the use of the act revoked. It was brought in to end, of course, the border blockades and the protest occupation near Parliament Hill, but it did stir its own controversy from day one. Some agreed it was necessary, some called it an overreach. Now, though, it's gone as quickly as it arrived. David Cochrane explains why the Prime Minister says today was the day to end it.
The streets of Ottawa have been mostly clear and quiet since Sunday. So with crews cleaning up and fences coming down, the Prime Minister says the time for emergency powers is over.
We are confident that existing laws and bylaws are now sufficient to keep people safe.
A surprise announcement coming while the Senate was still debating whether to approve the use of the Emergencies Act in the first place.
The Trudeau government failed to make its case.
Ms. Blaney. Ms. Blaney. Mr. Boulris.
And less than 48 hours after New Democrats voted with the Liberals to endorse it.
I declare the motion carried.
As I said, this was always proportional and time limited.
And now gone entirely. Since the police moved in, the gravitational forces that fueled this occupation are largely gone. The crowds dispersed, the money cut off. Key convoy leaders in jail or out on bail, but ordered to leave Ontario and have no contact with the convoy.
We've been calling all along for the moment that those provisions are no longer necessary to revoke it, and we're satisfied that today the provisions of the Emergency Act were revoked.
The NDP says the threshold has been met to revoke the order. The Conservatives say Trudeau is backing away from a power grab.
Nothing has changed in the past 48 hours except the Prime Minister, we believe, recognized how wrong he was to invoke it in the first place.
The emergency phase is over. Now the accountability phase begins. A special parliamentary committee will study the government's use of these powers, while a mandatory public inquiry will investigate the circumstances that led to these emergency measures in the first place. David Cochrane, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, the protesters may have left Ottawa, but not all of them have gone home. As Ashley Burke shows us, some are still gathered just outside the city, deciding their next move.
A vestige of a movement that took over downtown Ottawa for 23 days. A shrinking camp on private property not far outside the city. 60 vehicles seen here Monday, now roughly 20, and only a few large trucks. Protesters wouldn't let media inside the camp, but sent out a trucker to help us when CBC's van got stuck.
You guys are going to believe this story.
Wearing a Defund the CBC hat, trucker Tyson Garreau towed us out of the snow and live streamed it all.
We don't leave Canadians stuck no matter who. That's what I said. That's where I've been sleeping.
Garreau said he lost his job in road maintenance because he's been in Ottawa demonstrating all month for his grandchildren's freedom. Now he isn't sure what comes next.
The plans we were really unaware of right now, a lot is lying in the... we're not looking to cause trouble.
Paper towels, napkins.
One protester live streaming from inside the camp, committed to continuing to push back against COVID restrictions, but in a lawful way.
We're not going to convoy, but we are going to do a march.
This is just one of 3 camps that are set up within roughly an hour's drive of Parliament Hill. One is to the west in Armprior, another to the south in Greeley, and the third to the east in Vancouver Hill. These police officers are visiting the sites to tell protesters what they can and cannot do.
I'm sure the message is quite clear with these individuals that they will not be allowed back to the downtown area for obvious reasons.
This may be just simply sites where people can simply drink, dance, have fun after a couple of weeks. They may be plotting their next steps.
The Prime Minister said today that he still sees these camps as a threat, but that he's been assured by police they can handle it without use of the Emergencies Act, and that authorities are in a much stronger position to keep blockades and occupations from coming back to streets like this in front of Parliament Hill. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now let's bring Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton in on this. So Rosie, there are a few questions after today, one being, why now?
Yeah, Andrew, the government obviously was very aware for the potential for further political backlash here, but also the possibility of losing public support for this. There's no longer any one event or demonstration or protest that police presumably could not handle to point to as evidence that this was needed or still needed. So the criticism from all corners, even those who supported the use of the act in the short term, was that it either was overreach or it was going to become government overreach. And the last thing the Prime Minister wanted here was to be perceived as abusing his powers. As he said himself today, the emergency is over and so is the act.
Okay, so was it a success?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the question that we need to answer. It certainly will be answered in part during this inquiry and the review of the act that's built into the legislation. There are a series of court challenges that will test it. Whether it was a success, I would say, depends on where you're sitting. Ottawa residents would probably say for sure. Conservatives would say it was used because there was a failure to act before. Police would say they needed it in order to get the blockade ended. So the success question, I think, has yet to be answered. But 10 days after invoking the act, the blockade is over, and the federal government can at least certainly claim responsibility for helping to do that.
Okay, Rosie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, we continue to monitor developments in these early stages of a Russian military incursion into eastern Ukraine. On the other side of the break, we're going to touch base once again with Briar Stewart, who's standing by in Rostov-on-Don in Russia, but also on the other side of the border, inside Ukraine, in Kyiv, we have Margaret Evans standing by as well. More breaking news coverage right after this. Welcome back to our breaking news coverage of events that are unfolding right now as we speak in the early morning hours, local time in Ukraine. A Russian military incursion underway in the eastern part of the country. Reports of explosions being heard. But of course, it depends on what part of the country you're in. This live shot that you're looking at right now looks as if life is going on as normal, but that is not the case in different parts of the country. I want to read just a little bit of a statement that we have. This is from the Prime Minister, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying that Canada condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's egregious attack on Ukraine. Canada calls on Russia to immediately cease all hostile and provocative actions on Ukraine and withdraw all military and proxy forces from the country, and that Russia's actions will be met with severe consequences. One of a number of statements that have been issued by international leaders since the announcement and the commencement of the attack. We're going to go to Margaret Evans right now, who, of course, is in Kyiv, in Ukraine. Margaret, I can't help but wonder about what people there must be thinking, what they're talking about. What are you hearing there?
Well, Andrew, the sun is actually just coming up. We're starting to see a little bit of light in the sky. Let's hope it brings better news than we've been hearing all night long, but it doesn't seem so. It's hard to get a sense yet because there aren't a lot of people out and about. There are some people on their way to work. There's a cafe right next to me. A woman came in. She's been washing the floor in there. The hotel we've been staying at, there's been a bit of an exodus because we started to see a few days ago people coming in from other parts of the country to check into the hotel, moving further away from the eastern border, thinking that they might actually be out of the line of fire if they came to Kyiv. They seem to be on the move again. Throughout this conflict, or the lead up to this conflict, you'd have mixed feelings from people. A lot of people saying, look, we are used to dealing with an aggressive neighbor. We have been fighting this war in the eastern borders for 8 years now, and we're not leaving. We're not going to be intimidated. In other parts of the country, though, where we're hearing, that there's more intense sound of shelling, potentially explosions or air missiles, Kharkiv, for instance, we're hearing there that people are actually taking shelter in some of the underground metro stations, that there's a bit of a sense of panic starting to develop there. We were there just over the weekend talking with a lot of young people in the town, trying to remain calm. We went actually down to a party that a group of people who belonged to a co-op were having because they felt so nervous about what was about to happen. And there was a lot of moving testimony from people there, particularly the young people who have seen that city change over the past 8 years. This was a city that when we saw the separatist groups take over those territories in the eastern Ukraine after Russia annexed Crimea, there were thoughts that Kharkiv, this city, would be the third one to go that way. But they have turned consistently towards the European Union, and they spoke about their fears that what was about to happen and is happening was going to interrupt their lives. There was just a sense of disappointment that their country was under attack unfairly, and that the world was letting them down, because people have also felt very alone. There has been support from Western governments arming the Ukrainians, helping them, but they still feel very isolated, and I'm sure they'll be feeling isolated again this morning.
Okay, Margaret Evans reporting from Kyiv. This morning, your time, but tonight, our time here in Canada. Thank you so much for that. Now, Briar Stewart is, of course, in Rostov-on-Don in Russia, near the Ukrainian border and near the operation that Vladimir Putin says is underway. Briar, what is the reaction so far? I mean, what are you hearing on that side?
Well, that's right. The Ministry of Defense in Russia put out a statement that's been reported in Russian media, and I'll just read it here. It's a very short statement. It says the Russian armed forces are not inflicting any missile, air, or artillery strikes on cities of Ukraine. So obviously that's a statement that does not really align with the reports that we're seeing come from the ground from Ukraine. But we do know from officials in Ukraine that there have been some targeted strikes on military. That being said, there are reports, as Margaret said, about troops now landing in cities like Odessa and in Mariupol. Now, in terms of the rapidly developing story, the attacks all started after a speech by President Vladimir Putin was aired in Russia this morning. And that speech has been revealed now that it was actually recorded 3 days ago, so on February 21st. And the speech is really, it was a declaration of war against Ukraine. And in it, he talked about the need to demilitarize Ukraine. And he had a warning for not only Ukraine, for the West, saying that if there was any kind of interference with this Russian operation, that Russia would respond, and that plans were already in the works for a response. So it was a very chilling message, and it was one that was recorded 3 days ago. I have to say that I've been reporting on the military buildup for several weeks now, and the vast majority of Russians that I spoke with didn't think it would ever come to this. They thought that, perhaps Russia would go in and recognize Donetsk and Luhansk, because these were areas that were already run by separatists aligned with Russia. But most of the Russians that I've spoken to about this never thought that Russia would go in and launch this kind of full-scale invasion.
That's important context. Briar Stewart, thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. So we will continue to track the breaking news here. The atmosphere tense in Kiev. this morning, their time, tonight, our time. We'll be back after this with more.
We are going to show you the scene live.
Don't miss this live hour of breaking news.
What's the latest there?
What's happening now in Canada and around the world.
Stay with us right here.
CBC Rundown with Andrew Nichols. Weeknights at 7 Eastern on CBC News Network.
Isn't it time you got all that top 40 out of your system? Newfoundland and Labrador.
Iggy the bearded dragon ate a fly. Whoa, Mom, is this your new Buick?
It's our new Buick.
Did you know Iggy can change color to communicate?
I forgot to submit my essay.
Mom, my phone's almost dead.
Put it on the wireless charger.
Mom.
Use your Buick's Wi-Fi and upload it now.
That was fast. He can hiss like a cat. And he gets up on his hind legs and...
Welcome back to our breaking news coverage as we continue to watch the developments unfolding right now as we speak in Ukraine, with earlier this evening Russia's President Vladimir Putin announcing that there would be a special military operation about to unfold. And indeed, we have seen reports of explosions and even gunfire underway, particularly in the eastern part of the country. But we still don't know a lot about the extent of the operation, what it is that Vladimir Putin is hoping to achieve, how long the operation may go on, and so forth. So joining us right now to talk about some of that, Irvin Student, the editor-in-chief of Global Brief magazine. Irvin, we had you on the program just a couple of days ago, so good to have you here. Now, can you help us first just by reconciling the two things that we're seeing and hearing? So on the one hand, you see Kyiv, for example, life going on as normal, people going to work, shops opening up, and yet we hear reports and indeed an announcement from the Russian president that a military operation has begun. Square those two things for us and walk us through what you think is happening now.
No one knows what's happening on the ground, including, I suspect, the leadership in Kyiv and the leadership in Moscow. It is, Ukraine is a huge country. It's the biggest country in Europe after Russia, territorially, very big population as well, 40, 45 million, somewhere in between there. So we're in the fog of war. The Ukrainians, like the Russians, have been a lot through their history. So there's a certain sang-froid They're not deeply panicked. They're properly worried because they would know more than we would in the West through personal networks and information what's coming roughly. The other thing that is underappreciated is that the Ukrainians have a very rich sense of humor. And even through the war, I think that will keep them going. They know how to laugh. So that's how you square the two. But let us not underestimate the penchant of both sides for war. They're both warrior nations, and this can get very ugly very fast on both sides.
Because at this point, you know, of course, we have to acknowledge that anytime we talk about an incursion or an invasion, there's a pretty broad spectrum of violence that we could potentially see, from very little to quite a bit. But to try to figure out how much violence we might see, I guess we have to get at the intent. So what is Vladimir Putin, in your mind, trying to achieve at this point in time?
I think he has two audiences. His primary audience is domestic. And as I mentioned on the National last night with Janice, he's at the end of his règne, his fin de règne, as we say in French. So he's consolidating the fort for his successor. Big historical moves, the biggest country on earth. It's a very young country. It's in a rut. It's in a rut psychologically, spiritually, economically, administratively, and he's trying to reconsolidate the center in order to ensure that Russia doesn't crumble after he leaves, which is a real issue. And the second audience, less important, is us in the West and Ukraine in particular. Unfinished business, not so much after the Cold War, but really the general architecture of Russia as he again leaves office. The 2014 revolution, Ukraine, the Crimean annexation, as I mentioned, radicalized three houses, and it must be understood thus. It radicalized Ukraine, it radicalized Russia against Ukraine in the West, and radicalized us in the West against Russia. All of these parties remain radicalized, Russia and Ukraine especially. So it's in that context of radicalization that he's making some moves towards there, which, by the way, will further radicalize at least those two houses, Ukraine and Russia.
Can I ask you what you think the range of international response might be at this point in time? You know, our understanding right now is that the U.S. President Joe Biden is speaking with Ukrainian President Zelensky, you know, as we speak. What would you expect to see on the international stage?
I don't think that conversation is going to yield anything. I think we in the West have played most of our cards, and the economic cards obviously don't impress because the Russians, like chess players, would have already discounted those costs into their behavior and considered them acceptable given their larger goals at this point. The big cards are to be played, as I mentioned last time, by Asian countries. That is my hope. That is my proposal for anyone listening. I'm thinking of countries like Israel, which has huge networks in both Russia and Ukraine, 1/6 of the population Russian-speaking, and their analytics are superior. I'm thinking about China, India, South and North Korea, and Japan, maybe even Singapore to a lesser extent. These are countries that are respected within both Kiev and Moscow, that have relative neutrality. That is, they're neither NATO nor are they CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization post-Warsaw Pact. So it's got to be a neutral force, neutral diplomatic effort, but the military game will have to play its cards for a little while, its momentum, and then there'll be room for diplomacy. And I suspect both the Ukrainian and the Russian sides, chess players, will allow for that. They'll continue to speak to one another.
Well, we will see if the brinksmanship will come to an end soon, or whether this will be more of a protracted campaign. Irvin Student, very good of you to join us, as always. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. Thanks. And so, as we continue to track developing news, we want to thank you for joining us here on The National for this February 23rd. There has been international condemnation of Russia's actions at this point, following its announcement that it would be moving in with a special operation into Ukraine. We don't know the extent of that operation at this point, but we're going to continue watching. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The National. We are following breaking news tonight. The Russian president says a military operation is now underway in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign minister calls it a full-scale invasion and says the time for the world to act is now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has condemned what he calls an egregious attack. Our reporters in Ukraine, in Russia, and in Washington are ready with the latest in this fast-moving story. It is, of course, in Ukraine, where we will start. Margaret Evans in Kiev standing by, the capital. Margaret, what's the latest?
Well, Andrew, the sun is just coming up here. We have heard within the last hour the sounds of an explosion. It could have been anti-aircraft fire, we're not sure. Earlier, we were hearing reports of the sound of explosions around the airport outside Kiev. Some contradictory reports coming out. The mayor of Kiev saying that what people were hearing was anti-aircraft fire. We are hearing from Russia, from the other side of the border, that they are targeting command structures across Ukraine, but they are not targeting cities. The Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has contradicted that, saying that Ukrainian cities are coming under attack. We're hearing reports that troops are landing in the port city of Odessa. We're hearing that things are bad in Kharkiv, which is a city mainly Russian language, native Russian-speaking city close to the border with Russia in the north and the east. Here in the capital, people have been leaving. We've been seeing people coming down the street with their suitcases, but we've also seen people who look like they're going to work. We're hearing that there are long lineups at the gas stations around the city, so potentially people are thinking of leaving. I would say that psychologically here, many people would have thought that this day wouldn't come if there was actually an attack coming on the capital, on the Ukrainian capital. And again, we can't confirm that that's really what's happening yet. But I think most people would tell you that they didn't or couldn't imagine, and still wouldn't imagine, that Russia would want to attempt to occupy Ukraine. Certainly they would believe that Vladimir Putin is interested in potentially regime change here, and some people thought that he would attempt to do that by squeezing this country rather than launching a full-scale military operation, because we've seen a lot of hybrid warfare. We've seen yesterday, there were just, in the hours leading up to the explosions and the news that the invasion had begun, we heard about more cyber attacks here, with a number of Ukrainian government ministry sites going down. That's been happening in the days leading up to that. And of course, the economy here has been suffering. You've seen some businesses leaving the country. You've seen even before today's operation, you saw some major airlines starting to cancel their flights to Ukraine. And a destabilization in terms of psychological warfare, people really not knowing what to expect, whether there was an invasion, whether there wasn't, and it was starting to really fray on people's nerves. So it's still very, very early days, early hours here. We're waiting to see what developments come. And of course, we're watching social media to see what people are saying in other parts of the country as well.
Right. Psychologically, it must be unnerving, if not debilitating. But to your point, with so many conflicting reports and so many early reports coming out from all directions, important to take things one step at a time. Margaret Evans reporting from Kiev tonight. Thank you so much for that. Now, we've got Briar Stewart on the line as well. This coming from Rostov-on-Don in Russia. Briar, you're near the Ukrainian border, near that operation that Vladimir Putin says is underway. Can you tell us what you're hearing?
Well, what the Russian Defense Ministry has said is that they're taking targeted strikes against Ukrainian military installations. But of course, as you heard Margaret say there's conflicting information about, what is being hit and whether or not cities are under attack. As far as the picture here, we know that the airspace has been closed not only over Ukraine, but over the bordering region as well. So where I am in Rostov-on-Don, it's also been closed a little further to the west in Sochi. And so you have a rapidly developing situation. And this really all started after President Vladimir Putin had a speech that was aired on Russian television early this morning. And it was a speech, I should mention, that wasn't live. And Russian media is actually reporting that it was recorded 3 days ago on February 21st. And in that recording that was aired, it is essentially a declaration of war. He talked about how Russia could not live with the threat of Ukraine and that Ukraine had to be demilitarized. He then went on to talk about how if there was any kind of interference from the West, anything at all, Russia would hit back, and that he hopes the West hears that warning because plans were already in the works. So it was a very, chilling message really to hear. And then after that, that's when we started getting all of these reports of explosions in so many different cities across Ukraine. I should mention that, as we've been here in this area talking to people, even people who've been living in communities where they've seen the backdrop of tanks and heavy artillery for weeks, who have seen kind of the military built up around them, there was really a sense of disbelief among a lot of Russians that we spoke to that there would be some kind of full-scale attack. This is an area where they know about the war going on in Donetsk and Luhansk, and there was a lot of support, I would say, for Russia recognizing those areas, because you have areas where they are already controlled by separatists, they're aligned with Russia. Over 700,000 people in those regions have Russian passports. So there was a lot of support for that. But speaking to Russians about kind of a larger attack on Ukraine, most people just did not believe something like that would happen. I mean, even people that we were speaking to yesterday and the day before, they just didn't think that Russia would take actions against so many Ukrainian cities and military infrastructure. So it'll be very interesting to see just how the public responds to that, because as we know in Russia, there's been such a repressive system and a crackdown that you don't see the kind of large-scale protests here that you would elsewhere.
Right, and of course, we will wait to see to what extent this invasion will progress, how protracted a campaign it might be if it continues beyond the next few minutes, few hours, few days. We don't know. Briar Stewart reporting from Rostov-on-Don in Russia. Thank you. Let's go to Susan Ormiston in Washington. Susan, what are the international moves that we're seeing tonight?
President Biden has been speaking to Ukrainian President Zelensky tonight from the White House, where he is monitoring the crisis. Earlier, Biden released a statement where he said the prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering, and Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction the attack will bring. The U.S. and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way, he said. The world will hold Russia accountable. Now, President Putin made a chilling warning that you heard about, that any foreign attempt to interfere with Russia's actions will be met with, quote, consequences they've never seen. And he said that just as an emergency Security Council meeting got underway tonight, the Secretary General said this was the saddest moment in his tenure, and he demanded Putin pull back.
President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. Give peace a chance. Too many people have already died.
And there were some very heated moments tonight at the UN, with the ambassador of Ukraine telling the Russian envoy there is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell. The Russian envoy was trying to tell the council that this isn't a war, it's a special military operation. But Ukraine's interior minister, of course, has confirmed that what we've been hearing, missile attacks in Kyiv, blasts in Kharkiv, shelling in Mariupol, perhaps an amphibious landing at Odessa. What we don't know tonight still is how wide is this attack and how far Russia will push into Ukraine. Earlier today, we heard widespread condemnation of Russia's actions at the UN, including from Canada's Representative Bob Rae.
Russia and its acolytes can spin and can contort all they want, but the violations of international law are theirs. The loss of life, the wounding, the pain, the suffering are all their responsibilities.
Now, tonight, we are hearing from Ukrainian's Foreign Minister, Kuleba. He's saying on Twitter that the world must impose devastating sanctions. And we may hear more about that tomorrow as the G7 meeting gets underway virtually. Stronger sanctions, part of that discussion. The White House indicated this week it had a second tranche available, and Biden tonight said he will impose further consequences. But so far, it appears that President Putin doesn't care. Ukraine is shutting down its airspace, its civilian aircraft. Civilian aircraft is diverting around Ukraine. Overnight markets are falling. The price of oil rising above $100 US for the first time since 2014, and that was the last time Russia moved into Ukraine in Crimea. Andrew.
Susan Ormiston, lots to track on the international front. Thank you so much. Okay, now let's bring in Murray Brewster in Ottawa, because Murray, can you tell us first what we're hearing from the Canadian government on this?
Well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has issued a statement this evening, and he is calling the actions in Ukraine by Russia an egregious attack. And the statement goes on to say that Russia's actions will be met with severe consequences. Tomorrow morning, I will be meeting with G7 partners, and we will continue working closely and quickly with NATO and our allies to collectively respond to these reckless and dangerous acts. A couple things that we can pull out of the statement here tonight, Andrew. The first thing is that Canada will be imposing further sanctions against Russia. There were sanctions that were introduced on top of sanctions that were already there when President Putin declared the independent republics of eastern Ukraine and that they had Russia's support. So we can expect to see more sanctions. Canada does have a lot of room to issue sanctions against Russia, because it was 2019 the last time that Canada sanctioned Russia over any matters that related to events in Ukraine. But the other thing we can pull out of the Prime Minister's statement tonight is that there's going to be more consultation with NATO allies. As part of Canada's sanctions announcement the other day, Canada announced that it was going to be sending more troops to Eastern Europe to bolster the Canadian contingent that was in Latvia as part of NATO's Operation Reassurance. That those reassurance measures are for Eastern European NATO allies who are unnerved by what is taking place in Ukraine. And we can probably expect to see more support for NATO from Canada over the next few days.
Right. So that's the view from Canada. But Murray, talk to me about the operation in Ukraine that is unfolding right now, because you've been speaking with military experts. What should we be reading into the moves that we've seen so far from Russia?
It is a fast-moving situation, Andrew. Now, we are getting significantly reports of landings in Odessa, which is in the south of Ukraine. There have been reports of missile attacks on command and control centers, primarily around the airport, the international airport in Kyiv. There have been reports of explosions in Kharkov, close to the Russian border. President Putin basically said that this is going to be a military operation in the Donbass region in the eastern part of Ukraine. So we have forces that are apparently coming in from the south in Odessa. There appears to be more shelling and a major military operation underway in the east, and potentially there could be one in the north. So that gets Ukraine and the capital of Kyiv almost caught in a pincer. And we don't know the extent of the operations right now, but a lot of the military experts that I've been speaking to over the last several weeks have said that even with 190,000 troops, which is approximately what Western intelligence has suggested Russia has, Russia still doesn't have enough forces to be able to take and, most importantly, hold the entire country of Ukraine, because Ukraine is a vast country. So there's going to be an attempt by the Russian military, at least according to a number of experts, to perhaps go around the major cities and to cut them off and to isolate them over the next few days. Those are some of the things that we could potentially be seeing, in addition to a very sustained air campaign of missiles and perhaps bombs.
A broad array of possibilities in the coming hours and days. Murray Brewster, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
So as we continue to watch this breaking news unfold in Kyiv, in Ukraine right now, we're still waiting for many details. There's a lot that we don't know about the Russian incursion that they announced just hours ago. We don't know the scale of the strategic intent, what Russian President Vladimir Putin hopes to achieve with this military operation. We don't know the extent of casualties, or if even there are any at this stage of the game. We also don't know anything about specific targets, just that there have been sporadic, sometimes conflicting reports of explosions around Kyiv, around the airport, also around particularly the eastern part of the country, also in Kharkiv to the northeast. If I could, I'd like to take a moment here just to link up with Viktor Semenov, who's been kind enough to make some time to join us, because Viktor, you're joining us from Mariupol in Ukraine.
Yes.
Can you start just by explaining, I mean, were you awake at the time? Because this happened early in the morning when Russia announced its invasion and that it would be moving forward. Tell me what happened from your point of view, what your reaction was.
I was surprised the reaction, and I was awakened in an hour ago, not when the invasion began. And if I would say, was I surprised? Was anyone surprised in Ukraine? I would say no, because we defend ourselves for 8 years. It wars has never ended for the 8 years from the beginning, and we are just awaited all the time that Russia will do an invasion. But anyway, it's a war in Europe. They are doing a missiles attacks to our capital, to the cities near us, to my city. Here was an artillery bombing this night in our city. A lot of people was saying it was loud explosions, and now you have to understand it's a morning. It's an early morning in Ukraine, so a lot of people, most of people, don't know yet about the invasion if they are not in the cities that were attacked.
And
that's the situation.
Do you have any sense at this point in how much danger you or your family or your neighbors may be in at this point, in the sense of how far away you may be from the conflict, from any fighting that may be happening right now?
We are personally, in this Mariupol, we are in 10 kilometers from line. I do not know anything about how unsafe I am or how not, but I see now chats of my friends. They are telling in Telegrams, they are telling like, we are running away from the city. No one knows nothing. We believes that our army can stand for Ukraine, and all the world will support Ukraine. For now, we know nothing. There are explosions, there are artillery, there are a lot of messages about the troops of Russians that are invading near Kharkiv. They're striking Kyiv, they're striking the bases in Dnipro. There about information about troops near Mariupol from the sea. But we don't know actually a lot. We know that invasion was started and that Putin is invading Ukraine. It's the only things we know. For now, in city center, it's safe. But who knows? It's 10 kilometers to front line.
Right. And so, Viktor, how prepared are you right now if the situation changes? Because we know things are very fluid right now. And you mentioned how where you are right now is safe. You believe it to be safe, but that could change very quickly. What are you going to do from this point on? How prepared are you?
You have to know one thing. A lot of people are very angry. We have not fear. All the fear left in 8 years before. A lot of people now, some will run away from cities, some will stay. Personally, I and my girlfriend, we plan to collect our items to backpacks and go in 2 hours to when the city awake. We are going to the center where all the volunteers, the active part of Mariupol meet each other, and we will discuss the situation and choose how to protect our land against the invasion. Personally, I don't want to run from the city, but I don't know. I know nothing about the situation. If I'm still in the city center and if front line is 10 kilometers away, then I believe that Russia was stopped for some time outside the city.
You know, I'm struck by how composed you are in this moment. And you know, I take your point that, and I've heard from a number of Ukrainians that they've been in this sort of a situation, not just for the last few weeks or the last few months, but for years. Can I ask you, just on a human level, how are you feeling? How are you doing right now?
I'm full of fear, of course. It's 10 minutes ago, my voice was trembling. and it's war. I don't know. I have never been living in the time of war. I was read the books about World War II, World War I, and other conflicts, and I didn't expect to see war in my own eyes in center of Europe. Of course, I'm fear, yeah, but when you have a plan, the fear comes back, or not. It retreats from you. So I plan to discuss it with my friends, with the people in Mariupol, and do my plan and not to worry a lot, because we have no place to run. We have to stand for our place, our country, and to rely on our allies from all the world. That helps a lot, and I believe, and thank you for the help in Ukraine.
Victor Semenov, we wish you all the best. I hope you are able to stay safe. I hope you're able to get all the information that you need to make sure that you stay safe. And I hope you're able to get in contact with all of your friends and family to make sure they're okay as well. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you in advance. Thank you. Bye-bye.
We have more breaking news coverage coming your way over the course of the program as Russia commences its military operation into the eastern part of Ukraine. Lots more still to come on this story as it develops. We'll be back. Welcome back. We are following breaking news tonight in Ukraine. That country's foreign minister says Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of the country and says the world can and must act now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has released a statement condemning what he calls Russia's egregious attack. We do have reporters standing by in Kyiv, in Russia, near the border, and in Washington, D.C. We're going to bring you more on all of that in just a few minutes, but first we are going to turn to a major development today here at home. 10 days after the federal government made history invoking the Emergencies Act for the very first time, the Prime Minister says the emergency is over and use of the act revoked. It was brought in to, of course, end border blockades and the protest occupation near Parliament Hill, but it stirred its own controversy from day one. Some agreed it was necessary, some called it an overreach. Now, though, it's gone as quickly as it arrived. David Cochran explains why the Prime Minister says today was the day to end it.
The streets of Ottawa have been mostly clear and quiet since Sunday. So with crews cleaning up and fences coming down, the Prime Minister says the time for emergency powers is over.
We are confident that existing laws and bylaws are now sufficient to keep people safe.
A surprise announcement coming while the Senate was still debating whether to approve the use of the Emergencies Act in the first place.
The Trudeau government failed to make its case.
Ms. Blaney. Ms. Blaney. Mr. Bulleris.
And less than 48 hours after New Democrats voted with the Liberals to endorse it.
I declare the motion carried.
As I said, this was always proportional and time limited.
And now gone entirely. Since the police moved in, the gravitational forces that fueled this occupation are largely gone. The crowds dispersed, the money cut off. Key convoy leaders in jail or out on bail, but ordered to leave Ontario and have no contact with the convoy.
We've been calling all along for the moment that those provisions are no longer necessary to revoke it, and we're satisfied that today the provisions of the Emergency Act were revoked.
The NDP says the threshold has been met to revoke the order. The Conservatives say Trudeau is backing away from a power grab.
Nothing has changed in the past 48 hours except the Prime Minister, we believe, recognized how wrong he was to invoke it in the first place.
The emergency phase is over. Now the accountability phase begins. A special parliamentary committee will study the government's use of these powers, while a mandatory public inquiry will investigate the circumstances that led to these emergency measures in the first place. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, the protesters may have left Ottawa, but not all of them have gone home. As Ashley Burke shows us, some are still gathered just outside the city, deciding their next move.
A vestige of a movement that took over downtown Ottawa for 23 days. A shrinking camp on private property not far outside the city. 60 vehicles seen here Monday, now roughly 20, and only a few large trucks. Protesters wouldn't let media inside the camp, but sent out a trucker to help us when CBC's van got stuck.
You guys are going to believe this story.
Wearing a Defund the CBC hat, trucker Tyson Garreau towed us out of the snow and live streamed it all.
We don't leave Canadians stuck no matter who. That's what I said. That's where I've been sleeping.
Garreau said he lost his job in road maintenance because he's been in Ottawa demonstrating all month for his grandchildren's freedom. Now he isn't sure what comes next.
The plans we really are unaware of right now. A lot is lying in the... we're not looking to cause trouble.
Paper towels, napkins.
One protester live streaming from inside the camp, committed to continuing to push back against COVID restrictions, but in a lawful way.
We're not going to convoy, but we are going to do a march.
This is just one of 3 camps that are set up within roughly an hour's drive of Parliament Hill. One is to the west in Armprior, another to the south in Greeley, and the third to the east in Vancouver Hill. These police officers are visiting the sites to tell protesters what they can and cannot do.
I'm sure the message is quite clear with these individuals that they will not be allowed back to the downtown area for obvious reasons.
This may be just simply sites where people can simply drink, dance, have fun after a couple of weeks. They may be plotting their next steps.
The Prime Minister said today that he still sees these camps as a threat, but that he's been assured by police they can handle it without use of the Emergencies Act, and that authorities are in a much stronger position to keep blockades and occupations from coming back to streets like this in front of Parliament Hill. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now let's bring Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton in on this. So Rosie, there are a few questions after today, one being, why now?
Yeah, Andrew, the government obviously was very aware for the potential for further political backlash here, but also the possibility of losing public support for this. There's no longer any one event or demonstration or protest that police presumably could not handle to point to as evidence that this was needed or still needed. So the criticism from all corners, even those who supported the use of the act in the short term, was that it either was overreach or it was going to become government overreach. And the last thing the Prime Minister wanted here was to be perceived as abusing his powers. As he said himself today, the emergency is over and so is the act.
Okay, so was it a success?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the question that we need to answer. It certainly will be answered in part during this inquiry and the review of the act that's built into the legislation. There are a series of court challenges that will test it. Whether it was a success, I would say, depends on where you're sitting. Ottawa residents would probably say for sure. Conservatives would say it was used because there was a failure to act before. Police would say they needed it in order to get the blockade ended. So the success question, I think, has yet to be answered. But 10 days after invoking the act, the blockade is over, and the federal government can at least certainly claim responsibility for helping to do that.
Okay, Rosie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
And up next, we return to our top story. Russia launching a military operation inside Ukraine. Coming up, we've reached a resident in the capital, Kyiv. More breaking news coverage right after the break. Welcome back to our breaking news coverage of events that are unfolding right now as we speak. An attack that the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has characterized as a full-scale invasion. Russia certainly hours ago did announce that it was going to commence a military operation, a special military operation in the eastern part of the country. We have been hearing conflicting reports about potential targets and what is actually happening on the ground, but there have been sporadic reports of people hearing explosions and the like. Now, earlier, I was joined by Irvin Student, who is the editor-in-chief of Global Brief magazine, and I asked him, amid reports that people in Kyiv were just going about their normal mornings, despite this military operation happening, what he thought was going on.
Ukraine is a huge country. It's the biggest country in Europe after Russia, territorially. Very big population as well, 40, 45 million, somewhere in between there. So we're in the fog of war. The Ukrainians, like the Russians, have been a lot through their history. So there's a certain sang-froid. They're not deeply panicked. They're properly worried because they would know more than we would in the West through personal networks and information, what's coming roughly. The other thing that is underappreciated is that the Ukrainians have a very rich sense of humor. And even through the war, I think that will keep them going. They know how to laugh. So that's how you square the two. But let us not underestimate the penchant of both sides for war. They're both warrior nations, and this can get very ugly very fast on both sides.
Because at this point, you know, of course we have to acknowledge that anytime we talk about an incursion or an invasion, there's a pretty broad spectrum of violence that we could potentially see, from very little to quite a bit. But to try to figure out how much violence we might see, I guess we have to get at the intent. So what is Vladimir Putin, in your mind, trying to achieve at this point in time?
I think he has two audiences. His primary audience is domestic. And as I mentioned on the National last night with Janice, he's at the end of his règne, his fin de règne, as we say in French. So he's consolidating the fort for his successor. Big historical moves, the biggest country on earth. It's a very young country. It's in a rut. It's in a rut psychologically, spiritually, economically, administratively, and he's trying to reconsolidate the center in order to ensure that Russia doesn't crumble after he leaves, which is a real issue. And the second audience, less important, is us in the West and Ukraine in particular. Unfinished business, not so much after the Cold War, but really the general architecture of Russia as he again leaves office. The 2014 revolution, Ukraine, the Crimean annexation, as I mentioned, radicalized three houses, and it must be understood thus. It radicalized Ukraine, it radicalized Russia against Ukraine in the West, and radicalized us in the West against Russia. All of these parties remain radicalized, Russia and Ukraine especially. So it's in that context of radicalization that he's making some moves towards there, which, by the way, will further radicalize at least those two houses, Ukraine and Russia.
Can I ask you what you think the range of international response might be at this point in time? You know, our understanding right now is that the U.S. President Joe Biden is speaking with Ukrainian President Zelensky, you know, as we speak. What would you expect to see on the international stage?
I don't think that conversation is going to yield anything. I think we in the West have played most of our cards, and the economic cards obviously don't impress because the Russians, like chess players, would have already discounted those costs into their behavior and considered them acceptable given their larger goals at this point. The big cards are to be played, as I mentioned last time, by Asian countries. That is my hope. That is my proposal for anyone listening. I'm thinking of countries like Israel, which has huge networks in both Russia and Ukraine, 1/6 of the population Russian-speaking, and their analytics are superior. I'm thinking about China, India, South and North Korea, and Japan, maybe even Singapore to a lesser extent. These are countries that are respected within both Kiev and Moscow, that have relative neutrality. That is, they're neither NATO nor are they CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization post-Warsaw Pact. So it's got to be a neutral force, neutral diplomatic effort, but the military game will have to play its cards for a little while, its momentum, and then there'll be room for diplomacy. And I suspect both the Ukrainian and the Russian sides, chess players, will allow for that. They'll continue to speak to one another.
Well, we will see if the brinksmanship will come to an end soon, or whether this will be more of a protracted campaign. Irvin Student, very good of you to join us, as always. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. Thanks. And you are watching breaking news coverage on The National. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our breaking news coverage here on The National of the situation unfolding right now as we speak in Ukraine. Russia's President Vladimir Putin announcing a special military operation getting underway in the eastern part of the country, the extent of which is unknown, difficult to discern at this point for reasons I'm sure you can understand. There have been many conflicting reports up until this point about targets, about what exactly is happening on the ground. There have been sporadic reports of explosions, people either seeing or hearing explosions. But what we do know is that international condemnation has been swift. The U.S. president, Canada's prime minister responding, Justin Trudeau, saying that this attack was egregious and that there will be consequences. Now let's talk to someone who is very close to this developing story. Peter Zalmayev is in Kiev. He is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. First of all, Peter, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you. Well, I was woken up about an hour ago with these loud explosions, the sirens going off. I'm smack in the center of the city. The explosions were kind of distant, these loud sonic booms, about a dozen of them. Sirens are going off and lots of sounds of traffic. Obviously, the civilians have started to flee.
And right, so what is the protocol there? I mean, walk us through that. So when you hear explosions and the sonic booms and the sirens, what is it that you and the others in your nearby vicinity began to do?
Well, folks obviously are reacting emotionally to it. It's maybe part of a psychological operation that we've warned about all along. But the Ukrainian president spoke just a moment ago, and he said for folks to stay calm and to stay at home. This is probably not the time to flee Kiev, simply because it might be very difficult to do. The hope is that there will be no strikes on civilian centers. Vladimir Putin, whom you cannot take at his word at all, but at least he said that he's not doing so far. The indications are that he's going after military infrastructure, and other installations throughout the country. There may be an invasion on overland in the area of Odessa and Kherson and even Kharkiv. So far, folks in Kiev are saying that the explosions are happening around the city. Maybe a military airport may have been hit. There's a concern that when it comes to the center, there may be hits on ministries of defense, ministries of internal affairs, etc.
Right, because on that point, what is the fear in your mind and on your fellow Ukrainians' minds right now that there could be some kind of incursion, some kind of an attack on civilian areas where people live and work?
Well, you have to read, Vladimir Putin, reading him between the lines, obviously, when he said that, we're not going after civilians, we're going to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. And he said that we will bring to justice all those who've been waging kind of a genocide against people in the eastern Ukraine. So he's referring to the current government, maybe the previous government, members of parliament. That may mean that he's going to try to actually reach them, and the only way to reach them is by land. So that's a concern. And finally, a very ominous note to all who might want to defend Ukraine. He's appealing to the West to stand down. It sounds to me like a hint at a nuclear blackmail. He's hinted at nuclear blackmail in years past. He's provided this image of a cornered rat, likening himself essentially to a cornered rat. He says when the rat has been cornered, it will strike. And I think this is what we're hearing from him. Should you try to intervene, we're going to hit you with something you couldn't have imagined. That's, right. I think this is nuclear blackmail we're talking about.
Because what would be your appeal at this point of time to the international community, to anyone watching this situation unfold from the outside in?
This is not the time to back down. This is not the time to go all out with sanctions and hit them really, really hard. I think Johnson has already commented, and it seems like the Western leaders are trying to get their act together. It's just also what we're seeing is the results of this complacent policy towards Vladimir Putin. We saw this first escalation, if you remember, in the spring, and there was no response to that. All along, there were these steps that the West could have and should have taken to address each Russian provocation. It hasn't been done, and now you were paying a full price for that.
And so just as we have about 30 seconds left, what is it that you are prepared or even able to do at this point? I mean, you've had the advice to stay at home, not to flee. What is going through your mind as you think about what your moves are over the next few hours and the next few days?
Yes, well, obviously, you cannot rule out that this may be my last internet connection. The phones are also already working sporadically. So just trying to stay in touch with friends, having their physical addresses, so you can actually coordinate go to their places directly. But I'm staying right here. I'm staying right now in Kiev. There's no other way. There's no way to fly out anymore. So just, hoping and praying and staying calm. That's the only way you can do it.
Peter Zalmayev, you are remarkably calm in this moment. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I hope you are able to stay safe. A reminder of the breaking news that we are following tonight. You are looking at Kiev right now. The atmosphere tense after Russia announced that a military incursion in Ukraine's east has begun. The airspace over the country closed, with reports of explosions coming in. Welcome back to continuing breaking news coverage on The National. Here's what it looked and sounded like in Kiev in the early morning hours. You can hear that sound of air raid sirens. There were explosions as well. Russia's attack on Ukraine underway. For now, though, we are going to turn back just for a moment to this country and to Nova Scotia's inquiry into one of Canada's worst ever mass shootings. The events in and around Portapique traumatized an entire community, including some firefighters caught in the middle who 2 years later say they still don't feel heard. Kayla Hounsell explains.
On that terrible Sunday morning, the Onslow Belmont Fire Brigade had been turned into a comfort center. The gunman, Gabriel Wortman, was still on the loose when 2 RCMP officers mistakenly shot at the fire hall. They thought a municipal official in a safety vest was their suspect.
I lost part of my life, and fire hall was like a second home to me.
Fire Chief Greg Muse and his deputy were inside when the shots rang out.
We hid, under tables, under chairs for an hour, not knowing who fired upon us.
They say the officers left without explanation. Nova Scotia's police watchdog cleared them of any criminal wrongdoing. The firefighters initially hoped the inquiry would provide some answers, but they say they lost hope when investigators didn't even reach out to them until their lawyers pushed them to this month.
I've been disappointed all along, and the way the Commission has handled the proceedings so far.
The inquiry's mandate is broad. Public hearings opened this week with commissioners explaining life in rural Nova Scotia and the structure of policing. They're warning the next session, starting next week, will be much different.
I'm going to be real here. The information that we are going to start sharing on Monday is disturbing. It's awful.
The firefighters say their story is largely forgotten when the bigger story is told.
And I think that's just something important that people have to realize, that it's, there's pretty much an entire community that's been traumatized.
When hearings resume on Monday, the Commission will begin laying out what it has learned about those 2 days in April 2020. That will include sharing transcripts and audio of 911 calls. The final report is expected in November. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Halifax.
And we are going to take a short break, but we will be back right after this.
I'm alive! Can't stop, I'm afraid. Are you happy now?
Now we're talking. Today is a day everything changes.
Just have a good time. Cheers to that.
Welcome back to our breaking news coverage of an unfolding attack on Ukrainian soil. Russia has been massing troops on its border with Ukraine for months. The threat of an invasion always looming. The international community roundly condemning the dangerous posturing, opening dialogue with Russia's President Vladimir Putin to try to talk him back from the precipice. But whether through diplomacy, the threat of sanctions, or otherwise, that route has fallen short. Russia announcing hours ago that it was to commence a special military operation in the country's east, openly declaring the intent to demilitarize Ukraine. And both before and after that statement, we have seen sporadic reports of explosions in Ukraine's capital and in other major cities, such as Kharkiv in the northeast. We do not know the full extent of the attack, the extent of any casualties, if any, or damage, or for how long Russia plans to continue its operation. The international community, however, has roundly condemned the attack and said that there will be additional sanctions to come. This is a very fluid story, but that's where we'll leave things tonight. Thank you so much for joining us here on The National for this February 23rd. We'll continue to follow these developments over the coming days. Good night. Welcome to The National. We are following breaking news tonight. The Russian president says a military operation is now underway in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign minister calls it a full-scale invasion and says the time for the world to act is now. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has condemned what he calls an egregious attack. Our reporters in Ukraine, in Russia,